Hello again. I'm Dr. Randy Kearns, your professor for Management 4450 and 5450. We're down to our last 2 weeks. This week is PTSD and mental health preparedness, and we want to talk about it from the context of disaster preparedness and disaster response. Also, as you can tell from the assignments for this week, there's not a lot of activity that's due in the coming week. But I do want to be sure and point out that there's activity due both this week and next week, with next week. So this week is a discussion forum and a mental health paper that's due. And then next week is, if I'm not mistaken, it's winter storms, ice and snowstorms, and there's a quiz for that. Also, don't lose sight of the final paper that's due the week of May the 10th. And let me also go ahead and mention the final exam. The final exam is optional. It's online. It's exactly all of the same quizzes that you've seen in the past. And it gives you an opportunity to bump your final grade, depending on your score on the final exam, by as much as 5 points. If you're going into the last week with a low C or a low B or a low A, first of all, if it's an A, leave it alone. Nothing else to do, that's fine. If it's a low B or a low C, the final exam is not going to give you enough additional points to push you into the next letter grade. But if it's a high B or a high C or a high D for that matter, the final exam could give you enough additional points to push you into the next grade. Again, the final exam will not hurt your grade, but it will help your grade if you are on that cusp of getting the next letter grade, and if you have time and the effort and energy to want to focus on it. So with that said, let me go ahead and switch back over to the presentation, and let's get started with it. So some things we want to be sure and talk about, again, what's basic mental health awareness, talk about some of the normal reactions that people have in the aftermath of a disaster, how do you anticipate those things, and then what can you do to assist people, again, following a disaster. And a part of this is also to be mindful of the fact that if you're involved in a disaster response, one component of this, it's often overlooked. We spend a lot of time talking about preparedness. What are things that you can do to physically prepare and to be sure that you have the supplies, and intellectually to be sure that you're knowledgeable, to be able to put yourself in a better position so that you can survive a disaster. There's another aspect of that, and that's the mental health aspect. And that's what we want to at least be sure and talk about, at least briefly today. Just understand that everyone's involved, and everyone is touched by a disaster if they're impacted by the disaster. Some people may be impacted more than others, but everyone who is a survivor to a degree is also a victim of the disaster, and we need to think in those in that context. Just because they don't have an injury doesn't mean they aren't dealing with or coping with the types of stresses that, again, we'll at least briefly touch on here in the aftermath of a disaster. There is some physical components of it. There's the mental components of it. And then talking about how that impacts both our personal well-being, as well as how that may impact the greater community that we're a part of, again, in the aftermath of a disaster. There are implications for responders, and I don't want to overlook that. Again, there's this almost euphoric high of being involved in a disaster response, because you do get a chance to feel good about being able to help people who are, in some cases, in desperate situations, dealing with very difficult circumstances. And so this gives you an opportunity to be able to help someone. And if that's something that it typically makes you feel good about yourself. But it's also important to recognize that as much as that high may be there while you're providing that service, that aid to someone else, there's an aftermath to this, and that's what I want to prepare you for, and that's what I want to be sure that we spend a few minutes talking about today. Um, as far as the definition of a disaster, we've gone through this several times, and slightly the difference between a disaster and a catastrophe. Just understand that when those types of events occur, there's typically lots of humans that are involved, that have lots of suffering, that have lots of needs, and typically require and rely on outside assistance to help get beyond, help alleviate the crisis going on. And then the types of traumatic events really involve any of these situations: natural, technological disaster, human intention, interpersonal violence, traumatic loss. All of those things can lead to, again, this post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And we want to be sure, as we talk about PTSD, talk about what are signs and symptoms of it, and then how do we best deal with it, either when we see it in ourselves or when we see it in others. There is a reality that it's estimated that as much as 75% of the American population at some point will deal with PTSD in some form. If you've ever seen someone die, if you've ever seen someone with some type of catastrophic injury, the reality is you can't unsee that. And so there's an impact to that. There's a grief that you go through. There's at least some feelings that you have, and how you deal with that. And a part of that also is you almost have to suppress some of those emotions at the time that's going on, so that you can keep your wit about you, you can keep your head, and not also become emotionally attached and involved in the crisis or the disaster. Again, you've got to keep some distance so that you can keep perspective, and so that you can determine, again, a good course of action that makes common sense. And again, when we define traumatic stress, so there has been some research into this, and part of this is to help understand that traumatic stress is a real thing. We've referred to it, particularly in times of war, and a number of different terms, and we've tried to belittle people for it, at least at times. And the reality is we all suffer from stress at one point or another. And specifically when you deal with stress at a point that someone is impacted physically because of either a disaster or a traumatic injury, and you visually see those injuries or smell those smells, or all of those things that enhance your sense of how catastrophic this is, it can impact you in a pretty substantial way. And so when we talk about types of disaster response patterns, I've got a handful here that we'll go through: the cognitive part of it, the behavioral part, the physical part, and the affective part. Let's go back through each of those just a minute. Again, the cognitive part is all of those pieces that, how much duration do you have exposed to it? It could also include, the aftermath of either interpersonal relationships or school or work performance, certain flashbacks or nightmares associated with it. But there's a cognitive part of this. And then the behavioral part is it's almost the nature associated with people involved in this type of business. And that's, I don't want to say thrill seeking, but there's a part of helping people in times of crisis, again, has a certain element of reward to it. Being able to, crawl into a mangled car to help someone, to help stabilize them, and to be a part of the rescue where you're peeling away parts of the car that may have been impacted by another car or struck by a train. As I have a personal example of crawling into through the back window of a car that had been struck by a train. And I knew the person who had been injured, and I remember talking with her and staying with her and being a part of that rescue. And again, it was very rewarding, but it was rewarding because she had a very good outcome. It would have also been quite depressing had she died in front of me. And so again, part of this behavioral component also includes the outcomes associated with it. And then a part of this again gets back to what type of behavioral responses do we have associated with this. And then the physical part of this includes loss of appetite and headaches and vital signs, high blood pressure, elevated pulse rate. The insomnia comes from that because, again, you're excited. It's difficult to sleep. If you're ever involved in a disaster response, or if you're impacted by a disaster, there will be a period of time that it's very difficult to sleep because there's 1,000 things going on that you're thinking about. And even when you do nod off and finally get some sleep, it's really not that deep REM sleep that helps you feel rested. It's only an episode before, again, the arousals awake you of all of the stimuli, of all of the things you're thinking about related to the disaster. And then the affective part is, again, kind of that the depression, the anxiety, the guilt. If you're involved in this, and if you wind up staying involved actively, where or if you get involved in disaster response to the point that you're involved with a lot of different people and you see a lot of different patients, you will from time to time deal with death and deal with people who are dying or survivors of those who had loved ones who died or were lost in the disaster. And so you do have some guilt associated with that, and you begin to second guess yourself. Had we done this instead of that? Could we have saved more lives? There's always that second guessing that's there. And so a part of this, again, gets back to that healthy mentality of looking for ways that you can support one another, and looking for ways that you can support yourself, so that you can move beyond some of the depression associated with the aftermath of some of these types of events. In terms of psychological reactions to disasters, just the threat and the warning and the impact, just, the early pieces of a disaster can be mind-numbing. In fact, one of the hardest things to do, if you're ever a part of a disaster response, is to get people to rest before landfall takes place. And where I'm going with this is, some disasters may take, particularly with hurricanes, where it may take several days for the disaster to unfold. Well, the problem with that is, if you've stayed up nonstop for 72 hours watching this hurricane grow and gain in intensity before it finally comes ashore, Well, the moment that we really need you to be a part of in the aftermath of the response, you're tired, you're exhausted, and it's because you've stayed up almost nonstop for 72 hours. So early into, particularly with predictive disasters such as a hurricane, the no notice types events such as tornadoes, different story. But a hurricane, it's difficult, but you've got to get people into shifts or into cycles of where they're getting some rest before we have landfall, and so that we do have some rested people to step in and take over as we start to feel the full brunt of the storm, and of course in the immediate aftermath of the storm. And then kind of that next phase, in the immediacy of, as the disaster has just occurred, there's this heroic moment, there's kind of the honeymoon moment of where all the things that you do are typically seen as correct. And the inventory part is, survivors typically understand that there's limited resources, and and there's not enough for everyone, at least early on, in terms of supplies, in terms of rescuers. I, I'm fond of saying, the best way to deal with a disaster is to overwhelm it with resources. And when you find people who in large groups can tell you, I have no idea who's supposed to be helping us or where help is coming from, that's when you're not meeting your end of the bargain, so to speak, in terms of providing help and resources. And so kind of this final phase here is the disillusionment, and a part of that is, and in some cases it's far more profound than others. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina was an excellent example. There was a lot of politics involved, and at least early on, there was not the type of compassionate response that probably would have been nearly as helpful. Now later on there was a lot of response, but it took a long time to provide the types of services that should have been provided, that were provided just a year earlier in Florida in response to the 4 hurricanes that impacted Florida. And again, aside from the politics side of it, there were a lot of mistakes made by a number of agencies. But the reality is, at some point, people expect a certain component of reconstruction and recovery, and there's a certain how we envision things to be. And because the response was slow, by the time that overwhelming response did occur, it was a lot, but it was really late, and it left a lot of people again feeling disillusioned and feeling cut off from the government and the people that they expected to be able to help them. Now, again, there's a reality where people should be expected to help themselves for a window of time, but to also be frank, that window of time passed, and when it passed, there still wasn't a lot of help here, and made for a difficult situation. The 3 R's, resilience, resistance, and recovery, are certainly important, and again, helping us both physically deal with the disaster, but mentally deal with the disaster. That's a part of the value of a class like this. If you know what the steps are to be better prepared, the best disaster is the one you avoid. It's not nearly as exciting, and it's not terribly sexy in the disaster world. But the reality is, the more you can mitigate against a disaster and minimize its impact, the better off you're going to be, and the more likely it is when something does happen, it's a bump in the road rather than the end of the road. Healthy coping skills, again, quickly orienting yourself. What are the decisions that need to be made? The planning and execution. A lot of plans are pre-written well before the disaster, and help guide us during the time to try and make good decisions. What type of resources are available to us? Again, just having been involved in both the 2004 hurricanes that struck Florida, we had enormous resources. And so it gave us a great opportunity from a state level and from a local level and from a federal level to push in a lot of resources and help. I think all but one county in all of the state of Florida was impacted at one point or another by one of the 4 hurricanes, and several counties were impacted multiple times. And so being able to recognize where the resources are coming from and appropriate them accordingly is very important. And then understand that there's going to be certain things that are out of your control, and being able to tolerate that uncertainty. And then appropriate expression of painful emotion. Again, sometimes people, when they're really upset, it's interesting how the variety is there of how people will respond to those circumstances. I would just encourage you to think about how you can keep yourself under control, and think through the process. Again, actions help you deal with stressful situations, and action sometimes makes stressful situations much more difficult. Unhealthy coping skills, this impulsive or overdependence, it's okay to expect others to help you. The reality is, if others don't help you, be sure that you can help yourself. This denial and avoidance, again, what are ways that you can move past that? You've got to have caring and compassion for one another and provide emotional support. But again, a part of this is that balance of being supportive, being understanding, being empathetic, try and see their view from their viewpoint, and at the same level, try not to let it overwhelm you. Try to keep enough distance that it doesn't overwhelm you, but at the same time, you have enough empathy to understand, the pain that they're feeling, and to avoid substance abuse. That's, again, in terms of a coping skill, that can be substantially catastrophic. Yeah. Cultural factors, again, so there are different types of cultural factors that are important to factor in, and so it is important to recognize what type of local norms and mores exist, and how does the family unit interconnect, particularly in the South. How does the church play a role? What type of role does faith have in recovery? I'm from rural North Carolina. I'm accustomed to the Baptist men as an association providing a lot of logistical support. I've been involved in disasters in other states where it may have been the Methodist men, it may have been Catholic charities, but the point is, and just because they're called, at some point, both the Methodist men and the Baptist men were part of a designed organization. I can assure you that both organizations include women. I can also tell you that's what the name of the organizations are. But my whole point to that is just recognize that faith has a role in disaster response and disaster operations. Whatever help shows up. And if it represents one of those organizations, then have a plan or have a process in place. If you're managing the disaster, have a plan in place of how you're going to put them to work to help you. And we never turn away help, but we look for ways to channel it and to make it the most useful to help us all get through the situation we're dealing with. Now, sometimes we have all the help we need, and I've run into those situations where we have all the help we need, and we'll politely tell you we don't need any more help at this site, but I'm sure they need manpower at, and give them a place that they can go and check in and provide some manpower assistance. But all of these things get back to understanding the social norms and mores of a community. And if you don't, because you're not from there and you don't have a good connection to what it's like for people who are there, find someone who is, find someone who can give you that connection and help you understand that connection and that difference. So let's go through just a couple of steps in terms of things that will help you. The listening skills and the patience, caring attitude, trustworthiness, being approachable, culturally sensitive is incredibly important, non-judgmental, and flexible and tolerant of chaos. It's incredibly important to be able to wade into chaos and keep your head about you. You have to maintain an even keel. And, sometimes some of these things can be really distracting. Explosions, heat, people yelling, screaming. But you've got to maintain a clear vision if you're going to see your way through to what the solutions should be. I get back to plans. If you own a business, develop some type of a business plan of how you recover from it. Plans help people provide guidance of things to do when they feel like they're useless or they've run out of things to do. Plans are typically developed when we're clear-eyed, when we're not kind of in the fog of war, so to speak. And plans create guidelines to help us navigate back to what should be a more stable situation in the aftermath of the disaster. And it's also important for others to see in you that stability and again, that lack of chaos that will help them keep their head about themselves also. The psychological first aid is important. It's also important to recognize that people suffer from PTSD at varying levels, at varying times. What are ways that you can alleviate stress? I was always a fan of the TV show MASH, and although they did have some substance abuse that they used as a means of relieving stress, there were a lot of antics in that show that did remind you of what are things that people do to relieve stress and what's clearly a very stressful and a very difficult situation. It's important to look for ways to deal with that. When we've had downtime at some of these types of disasters, early on we're operational 24 hours a day, and we have people working in 16-hour shifts and sleeping about 6 hours, and the other 2 hours is either getting a shower or getting a meal, and if you're lucky to get a shower or get a meal. And then again, there's a lot of very hard work involved. And so as soon as you can break some people away from that type of cycle, away from that type of active involvement and active engagement, the better off you're going to be and the better off they're going to be. Other pieces of this, again, this safety and comfort and stabilization and practical assistance, all of these things are just recognizing what are coping mechanisms to help people deal with and understand both the impact of the disaster and the aftermath of the disaster. One of the things that we actually brought into a field hospital several weeks into the hospital. We couldn't do this early on, but particularly for people who'd been there for several weeks, there was a service, massage service that offered to come in and give neck and back and facial massages. And I'm not the type of person that I think that that's something I enjoy, but there are a lot of people who did. And we saw it as something that would successfully help people, again, recover from and get a better outcome from their downtime. And so, again, we're just looking for ways to help people get through the crisis that's going on. Other parts of, again, this responder safety and responder first aid, and I've said this previously, but again, the remain calm, the how we stay connected to one another. What are the different ways that we can look to support one another, and what are different ways we can look to stay connected to one another? It's also important to recognize what are things that you shouldn't do. I managed several really large response organizations at one point or another in my career. And one particular time we had a house fire that claimed the life of 4 or 5 children. And it was incredibly stressful, particularly for some of the early arriving responders who were, obviously expecting to be a part of a rescue operation instead of, a body recovery operation. And anytime, I can tell you, it's anytime you lose a child, it's stressful. If you lose multiple children, it's incredibly impactful. The mother briefly lived, but she died of her injuries several weeks later. But more than anything else, I remember in the immediate aftermath of that, getting people together and taking them off shift and calling in another set of crews to replace them. And some wanted to talk about it and felt like they needed to kind of talk it through. Some just wanted to get out of there and get home and get a shower and get away from work. And all of those things are right. And so that's my point. Let people decide what's best for them. If people want to tell you their stories or they want to talk about it, be sure there's an opportunity for them to be able to talk about it. But if people also want to disengage and get away, allow them to do that too. Now, you do need someone to check on them just to be sure they don't start that cycle of blame, or they spiral into considering hurting themselves. So it's the gamut. And if you're managing one of these operations, allow people to be themselves. Don't say everything will be okay if you know it's not. One of the things that I always tried to do was use phrases that were truthful and honest. We're doing all that can be done. This is a very difficult situation. We're gonna do our very best. We're gonna do the best that can be done under these circumstances. But this is a very difficult situation. And to be honest with people and to say, it's a very difficult situation. I used to use the phrase, he's very sick. Particularly if someone's dying, I know they're dying, and there's probably not going to be a good outcome to this. I want them to know, I want to reassure them that we're doing all that can be done, but I also want to be honest and say, he's very sick right now. This is a very difficult situation. We're doing the best that can be done under these circumstances, and we're moving on to the hospital now. But I just need you to, follow along behind us. We're going to the hospital, things like that. Don't lie to people. Don't say everything's going to be okay if you know it's not going to be okay. But come up with phrases that are comfortable for you to say in terms of, we're doing all that can be done. This is a very difficult situation. We have all the resources available to us at the moment that's focused on getting the best outcome possible. He's very sick right now, or he has a lot of very serious injuries. All of those things are kind of nebulous, but allow you to say something and tell the truth. And be sure not to make promises you can't keep. Don't say, if someone used to tell me, promise me he's going to be okay, I would honestly say, I can't promise you that. I can promise you that we're doing all that can be done right now. But he's very sick, and we're going to go to the hospital right now, or we have all the help that's available to do the best we can do. And we're certainly hoping for the best. And then intense emotions, you've got to communicate calmly. You've got to be rationally. In a disaster type setting, people are sometimes upset. Sometimes they're really upset. Being able to keep a certain sense of calm about you, being able to make eye contact, to speak straightforward and yet be polite and be respectful, certainly helps de-escalate the situation. Sometimes people get very angry, if something caused an event, if people are threatening, again, look for a way to, I always look for a way to talk my way out of a situation. Obviously, if I need, law enforcement as a part of the response, they're involved. Again, that's the difference between small events and much larger events. In much larger events, typically people understand, the gravity of the situation, the enormity of the situation. But all of this comes back to treat people with respect, treat people with dignity, be polite, be professional. It's a very difficult circumstance. It's a very difficult situation. And then last but not least, make referrals. If you're working with somebody, or if you operate a business and you have employees who are struggling with this in terms of coping, what type of employee assistance program, EAP, do you have, or what can be made available so that people from a mental health standpoint have someone to talk to, from a professional standpoint. Again, people deal with and cope with these situations in completely different manners. There's no one size that fits all. I try never to make, we have a mandatory meeting. Everybody has to come back to work because we had this terrible event. We want everybody to talk about it. That's really a bad idea. Be sure that you make available resources, so if people want to come back and want to be a part of it, then they can, but they don't have to. Again, we all deal with stress in our own way, and we all cope with it in our own way, but look for the people who, and stress is normal, but look for people who are struggling to recover from bad situations, because not everyone deals with this the same way. And then probably the big one here that stands out that I can't say enough about, and that's when anyone talks about suicide, or they joke about suicide, or they openly start planning on giving away things, take that seriously. Suicide is such an unforgiving event, and so I just can't say enough about the fact of, if someone is threatening suicide, we have to take them seriously. We have to get them some help, and we have to refer them to someone, or we have to be sure someone is following up with them. Again, there's such a level of permanence that in some circumstances you just can't go back from. And so, in some circumstances, because of the method of attempting suicide, there's a chance of recovery, but in certain circumstances, it's final and it's quick. And as much as we can avoid getting to that point, the better off we're going to be, but certainly the better off they're going to be. And then confidentiality. If someone tells you something in confidence, I would keep that in confidence. The one deviation I would add to confidentiality is if I ever heard something that made me feel like someone was going to harm themselves. I had an obligation, and you have an obligation, to be sure someone else knows that. Even if that's told to you in confidence. There's a reality, there's a clear and present danger issue in terms of the threat to their life, or if they threaten someone else's life. What are you going to do, and how are you going to deal with it? And then I've included some additional resources, but the big picture here that I would tell you in any disaster is, again, keep your head about you. Look for ways that you can maintain some calm. If there's a long-term event that's building, try and get some rest before the event takes place, because if you've stayed awake for 72 hours, kind of planning on the disaster, by the time it strikes, you're in no shape to respond to the disaster. That's been a common problem that I've seen. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. As a reminder, we have a short week next week, and the final exam is optional. But if you have questions, be sure and let me know. We have an online discussion this week, a short paper this week, and a big paper due next week. So that's it for now, and I hope you have a good week.